And now we can talk a little bit about Israel. And I saved this because, oh, it's ugly for me. It's ugly for me. But I see it the same way. It's seen as this fair rivalry of sorts. It's viewed by Jews. And I say that I was raised this way. It took me about 10 years to deprogram myself from a lot of being raised very pro-Zionist, from a very, and this is something that people don't talk about. And in all fairness to Jews and older Jews and the older generation, they are coming at this from a post-trauma mentality. Okay. Right. It's a collective trauma. And so my grandparents, for example, were very fear-based in their thoughts about Israel. Okay. It was very post-Holocaust, and it was a post-trauma. Okay. So now we've had time to sort of like do a breakdown and look at it a little bit more reasonably and rationally. And we have to now acknowledge that this is not a fair dispute. This is not a two sides of equal, values. This is not a fair fight. And so what we have is we have the other side, if we would call it sides. And I only say that speaking on behalf of my neoliberal Jewish friends down here. What we have is what's considered the opposing side that really isn't. Okay, they're not. And we just talk about punching people when they're down. And I want to just tell you this before I ask you, to go into it further. When I reference Gaza, and I try to do this as clearly as possible, I try to tell people this. We have human beings that are being born into captivity. Now, if that were orcas, oh, they'd be freaking out. We can't have the orcas. We don't want it. We don't want to have kids separated from their parents at our border, but we're okay doing stuff like this in other countries and having children being born into captivity. And I don't think people really understand what that is. I think they really see it's like an even fight. Like they're them, it could go either way. And could you please describe a little bit the complete inequality of what we're talking about? Yes, some Palestinian might come up to a wall and they throw a tire that's on fire. So then we gun down their whole family. And I just think people need to understand this disparity and that it is not a fair fight.
Yeah, I mean, Israel's a colonial state, right? It was founded as a ethno-nationalist state, as a Jewish state, and it was meant to be majority Jewish in an area of the Middle East that historically was not majority Jewish. And in order to make that happen, they had to commit crimes that all colonial entities have to commit in order to carry out their project. In this case, that meant the mass displacement and ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population, that being Palestinians. And of course, they weren't able to get rid of all the Palestinians. So there's like a different tier depending on where you live in Israel. I think there's about 5 million Palestinians altogether.
Yeah.
Between I'm not talking about those that live inside Israel proper. Maybe I am. I might be getting my numbers wrong. Maybe it's about 6 million altogether.
Well, all I know is that Israel's sole concern is keeping majority. They're going to do whatever it takes. Right.
Everything's about demographics. It's like, think about it, I think the best way for people to understand it in the US is the Jews in Israel, Palestine are white and Palestinians are not white. And it's a country that wants to be majority white.
And it's pre 1964. So
right. Okay. So basically what you have in Israel, Palestine is you have different systems of oppression depending on where. So you've got Israel proper, that's the area that's considered actually Israel, where you have 1.5 million or so Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, but they're second-class citizens, right? Because there's literally parts of the country where they cannot live, they're Jew-only neighborhoods. Think about it as white-only neighborhoods.
Yeah.
There's 50 different laws on the books.
It's redlining people. It's redlining.
That discriminate against non-Jews. And then you have the Palestinians, 2.5 million or so, maybe 3 million in the West Bank. These Palestinians are under complete military occupation. They don't get to vote for the people who are in charge of them, the people being the Israeli government, the Israeli military that basically controls every aspect of their lives and movement. They're surrounded by Israeli settlements, most of which are on hilltops and overlook them kind of like military bases. They have separate roads and highways. And their homes can be demolished at any time if Israel wants to demolish their village and turn it into a settlement, which has happened all across the West Bank. And, you know, you can be shot at and killed by the Israelis. You can be arrested. You're subject to military law, while the Jews in the neighborhood next to you, the Israeli settlers in the neighborhood next to you, are subject to civilian law. It's a very segregated, like South African apartheid style system in the West Bank. That's the best comparison. You know, we have people from apartheid who grew up in apartheid South Africa who will tell you that that's what it's like.
Look, you know what, people get mad when you use that term. And you know what though, by definition, this is an apartheid state. So you could sit there and not like it because it hurts your sensibilities to think of the beloved state of Israel as committing these kinds of acts. And I understand it's upsetting to me too, as somebody who does actually love the state of Israel. It bothers me. But think of it this way. I'm not happy with what this country does most of the time. So why would I be happy with what one of our allies is doing most of the time? Right. They are just an extension of us. It's us. It doesn't, you know.
Exactly. Well, it's an extension of Europe. I mean, it's a European colonial project at the end of the day. And, you know, you mentioned the Holocaust. I mean, what Israel and the entire Zionist movement have done is they have weaponized the traumatic memory of the Holocaust to justify oppression. And that's what's really disgusting about the entire project, right? And then you have Gaza, which is a different level of cruelty, because Gaza is an open air prison where people cannot leave. It's one of the most densely populated areas on earth. It's like got 2 million people in it. And literally it's like a very small strip of, it's not a very large area of land. It's like in the coast. And people are surrounded by, you know, like they're surrounded by Israeli towers, the Israeli military. If they go too close to the fence, they'll get shot and they'll get killed. You know, it's funny in a really dark way. For years, like a lot of these columnists like Thomas Friedman and David Brooks and like Jeffrey Goldberg would be like, why can't Palestinians just, you know, protest peacefully? You know, they've never tried that before. I can't remember which one of them. It was like one of those columnists. I think it was.
Never done that before.
I think it was Thomas Friedman, but I'm not sure. It might have been Thomas Friedman it was Nicholas Kristof, I think, who was like, I'm just listing mainstream media pundits who I hate at this point. But anyways, I think it was Nicholas Kristof who was like, if Palestinians would just en masse, you know, go up to the fence and get shot, the world would be shocked and they would get their rights. Well, you know what? For the past several years, Palestinians in Gaza have gone up to the fence and they've had their kneecaps blown out. They've been like crippled and killed by the Israelis, and no one has cared. No one in the world has cared, because the plight of Gaza just like doesn't even matter at this point. Gaza experiences these sort of periodic, every 5 or 6 years, Israel will just pound the crap out of Gaza and just like bomb everything. There's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to go. There's no future. It's miserable and terrible. And, you know, I think the Palestinians in Gaza probably have it the worst. And it's you know, everyone's called it an open air prison. And it's just at this point, you know, it's almost 2021 and we still have this like colonial state that exists. What's funny, I mean, I don't know where you stand on this issue. But anybody, I mean, at this point, there's no possibility of a two-state solution, even if you believe in it. It's just physically not possible. The facts on the ground will not allow it to be.
I know.
The only realistic option for this place is to have a democracy, like where everybody gets a vote, including, you know, Palestinians and Jews. And, you know, that's where the fight is now, is people, you know, either agree with that or they don't. And those that don't agree with that are basically just kind of showing themselves, they're showing their true colors. They're showing that they agree with indefinite occupation and apartheid, because that's the option, right? It's either indefinite occupation and apartheid or
you give everybody rights.
Or you give everybody rights. And I didn't think equal rights were that controversial. But they're so controversial. The idea that equal rights in this area of land is so controversial to like American supporters of Israel, that they're trying to, you know, create these laws across the country to equate calling for equal rights in Israel-Palestine with anti-Semitism, which is like the biggest joke ever. And also makes a huge, you know, it makes a mockery of actual anti-Semitism.
I say this all the time. It's so, and as a Jew, it's extremely, extremely infuriating, because we do see legitimate, actual cases of anti-Semitism all the time. All the time we see that. So we don't need to make it up when it doesn't exist. And criticizing a government, criticizing a sovereign state is not criticizing a religion. Now,
it's also dangerous. It's also dangerous to equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, because you're essentially just equating the state of Israel with Judaism. And
that's by design.
That is the territory of anti-Semitism. If you want to equate the oppressive and violent acts that Israel as a country carries out with a religion, that is dangerous.
But I will tell you what people here think. Like, this is what I get. Like, if I'm going to where like the older Jews are, and the truth is, on paper, I support a two-state solution, and the truth is, in my utopian universe, that could be possible. But I do not support anything that's going on right now. I mean, this is I haven't for years, and so I'm considered a self-loathing Jew. Max Blumenthal and I joked about that at one point. You know, to be a self-loathing Jew. But it's a massive thing. But what the fear-based mentality is here, and I can even be very specific as to Gaza, what they think. They're like, well, that's all because of Hamas. Those people, they voted for the wrong leaders. If those people would just not, it's Hamas. And if we let down the restrictions, then they're just going to come in and take over and kill all the Jews. So this is really, and it sounds hyperbolic, but I assure you that's the mentality. And it is that very post-Holocaust mentality. And it's also this very fear-based thing. And we see it here with race. So basically the premise is, it's almost like the Jews sort of subconsciously know, well, if we open it up, maybe they'll be as shitty to us as we were to them. And it's the same concept in this country with race. You know, whites assume that just because you give Black people power, they're going to come back and use it against you. You know what? Not everybody's like that. So
also, historically, this has always been a fear of the people in power. I mean, even in South Africa, in South Africa, like, you had a minority white population that was like really scared because they were completely outnumbered. Like, if we give all these Black people who we've like treated like crap, if we give them all rights, like, there's way more of them than us. But you didn't see a slaughter afterwards. And there are ways to like prevent that from happening, but you know, it's a powerful, I almost feel like you can't convince somebody who's 70. You can't convince an American Jew who grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust. You can't, you're not going to change their mind. Like, I've seen that, not just with I've seen that with other issues too, not just with American Jews and Israel and the Holocaust.
No, I mean, old people in general.
Right. It's when someone's like 70 or 80 years old, like, they're pretty set in their ways. It's very, very difficult. It's like trying to convince a 70 or 80-year-old who grew up in the Cold War fear-mongering era that socialism's good. Yeah.
I do that all the time. And down here we get the double whammy of like the Cuban population and the old Jews. So I'm a self-loathing Jew and a communist. Right. So yeah, I relish in those labels because it's so hilarious. But the truth is, I do want to reach these people, and these people that have been brainwashed as Zionists. And I know where they come from because I come from there. I know that mentality. It took me a lot of years. So I want to find the best way to do it without it being like a shock to the system. And
what's so interesting to me is how, like, when you look at younger American Jews, like, their positions on Israel are completely skewed in a different direction because they don't have, they're so far removed, like, generationally from the Holocaust and from that really like being able to be used as like a weapon in the way they frame their understanding of the Middle East. And so it's interesting to me how increasingly the pro-Israel demographic in the US is moving from American Jews to like these like Christian evangelicals.
Well, you know why. Right? You know why.
Well, right? Yeah, because they want the rapture.
Right. They don't care. And I tell the people sometimes, they don't give a rat's ass what happens to the Jews. They just need them all in Israel so that the rapture can happen. After that,
they want you to burn in an everlasting like fire, like lake of fire. Is that what it is?
Yes. But as long as we're all in Israel, so in order for that to happen, Israel needs to be a Jewish state.
Right.
And so, I always say, like, talk about like people that just come together for one issue, but otherwise they wouldn't have nothing to do with you. That's
the issue. Yeah.
Because they do think we're burning in the fiery pit of hell.
No, 100%. That's literally what they're hoping that happens so that they can be raptured.
And then crazy is it that we have had leaders of this country that believe that.
Oh my God, Mike Pompeo's like a rapture-ready Christian fundamentalist who like wants to bring about the building of the third temple. Like Mike Pence is the same way. These people are
that's when people would talk about, oh, we got to get rid of Trump. I'm like, not unless you're taking Pence with him.
You're taking Pence.
No, he ain't a prize. I'll tell you that. No, I always said I prefer the orange troll to the evangelical. As disgusting as that is.